Right, so let's create our first very simple hello world Angular application. Okay, I'm going to create here a directory where we can play around with an example trivial application. So lectures, and in here we'll create a little directory where we can create a little Angular hello world, Angular. And in here we'll create a little hello world here, hello. And this will be our very first index page. And add it to Git, yes, always add it to Git. And here's our very first full-blown index page. And for right now, this will just say h1 hello from index.html. Okay, and I'll start the server, and let's navigate to it. It will be under public lectures Angular hello index page. Okay, so let's go there. So this will be under lectures, Angular hello dot index page. There we are. Right. So we're in that file. Everybody okay? All right. All right. So let's load the library, the Angular JavaScript library, right, which is going to be is going to allow us to dynamically render the page on the client side. Right. Remember, we're not going to focus on server side rendering of pages. Instead, we're going to render most of our content on the client side. Right. And for that, we'll need JavaScript libraries such as Angular, jQuery, and things like that. All right. So let me load first the Angular library. To do that, I can install it locally. I can say npm install Angular. Okay, and it should now be available here somewhere. There it is, Angular. There's my Angularjs. There it is, and it's the latest 1.x version. I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to deploy it. I'm going to put it locally on inside of my public directory. Okay. One common place to put it would be under a directory called JS, right? Or if you have many libraries that you're using, a very common place to put it is under a directory called vendor, right? Meaning to distinguish JavaScript files that you're writing versus JavaScript files that you are using from someone else. Okay, so that's very well delimited. So under vendors, I'll put here a directory called Angular, and in there I'll paste Angularjs. Now that it's there, from within my index page, I can load that library. Right? I can load that library and say script. So script is an HTML tag that allows us to load JavaScript files, and we need to tell it where are they. And they're typically we need to navigate physically to where it is. We're under here under lectures. We need to go up 1, then 2, then 3, and then down to vendor, down to Angular. Yes? So let's do that. Let's go up 1, twice, 3 times, then down to vendor, down to Angular, and down to Angularjs. There we are, right? So there we are. We have the Angularjs library loaded. Now the Angularjs library, right, is a library that forces you to think in a particular way about web applications. Okay, web applications have been around for quite a while, much before Angular, right? And there have been very mature ways that have become very standard over the years on how to think about web applications in general, right? One such way of thinking of applications is by splitting it into 3 distinct aspects, right, or 3 distinct concerns, right? One concern is to render something for a human being to consume. That a human being can consume, right? To render something for the user, right? And usually we call this the view, right? Anything that has to do with representing something for human consumption, we call it the view. Right? Anything that has the concern of storing data or representing any relationship between different pieces of data, right? And structure that data, we refer to that as the model, right? Of how to store that data and retrieve that data and manipulate that data. Okay. Anything that has to do with logic about what happens first, in what order, in what's the sequence. If this happens, then that should happen, right? That is a responsibility of what we call the controller, right? So this has become a standard way of thinking about fairly large applications referred to as the model view controller design pattern. Okay, that has proven very successful across a few decades already. That has been very successful on the server side, right? This idea has been around for quite a while and has been proven very successful on server-side applications. And what Angular has done, and many other libraries, JavaScript libraries, says, "Ooh, let's copy that idea." Okay, that has proven very successful, and let's reuse that on the client side. Right? So Angular splits up an application into these three distinct buckets of concerns. Right? So the HTML is what renders for the user. So everything that falls in the HTML, the CSS files, and those things are all view. Yes? So we are already in the view. This index page, we are already in the view. Okay? Let's create a controller. Right? The controller, again, is the responsibility of interpreting all the events, right? As the user generates these events, what should happen, what things should be created, removed, and things like that. The controller does not have the responsibility of maintaining any data. It knows where to fetch the data, maybe. Hello? Marriott Hotel. Anybody? It's like a Mr. Bean's episode. Where was it? I have no idea where it was. Right, the model view controller. Oh, I got it. Okay, so that was awkward. We have the Angular. Breathe. Completely lost my train of thought. Right, so we're already in the view, and we need a controller. Right, so we need a controller, right? That tells us how to handle the different events that the user generates, right? So let's do that. We need to marry somehow, right? That this view depends on some logic, right? That handles all my events, right? So let's do that. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is declare this as an Angular application, right? And what Angular does is that when we load this Angular.js file, this is a very powerful library, right? It takes over the entire page, right? It parses our page, right? It's completely aware of what's going on this page, right? One of the things that it does is that it declares several new HTML attributes that weren't there before, okay? For instance, these are all HTML attributes: lang, character, set, src. Those are all HTML attributes, right? And these are all HTML tags, right? HTML elements, right? The script, the title, the meta, head, right? What Angular allows you to do is to create your own, right? You can create your own library elements. If you don't like the HTML language, you can create your own language, your own HTML elements. If you don't like the attributes, you can create your own attributes, right? Usually what it does is that it adds new attributes as opposed to overriding existing ones, but it can also work together, right? And we will see how to create our own a little later, right? In general, these are referred to as directives, Angular directives, right? And here's one of the more common ones, ng-app. And you'll guess what that is, right? It allows us to declare this as an Angular application. All Angular directives, right, like this, they all start with ng dash, right, to be able to distinguish them from normal attributes, right? These are all normal attributes. This is an attribute that was declared by Angular, right? And what they do is that these directives allow us to tie the view with some code that is associated with this directive. And we'll see how that relationship happens a little later, right? Right now, let's be a little bit way up here. Let's declare this to be our to-do app, a to-do app. Okay, let's declare a new to-do app. If we load this, notice that it's complaining right away. It's complaining, saying, "Oh, something went wrong." If we look at the console, it's complaining that, okay, you declared a to-do app, but I don't see where it's declaration, right? You are associating this view, you're associating this entire view to an application called to-do app, but I don't see where it's being declared. So an additional thing that we need to do is actually declare this application. Let's do that, right? We're going to declare it in another script, which we're going to write, and we're going to call it app.js. Here's where our application is going to live, right? Under the app.js, and we're going to write this. Notice that we did not put it in the vendor because this is not somebody else's JavaScript. It's our own JavaScript, right? We're writing this JavaScript, right? So let's create let's create right here. We're inside of the index page. Right there, we're going to create our app.js right next to our index page, JavaScript. There it is. Okay, and so this is our very, very first Angular application. Okay, and this Angular application, we're going to declare it using the variable or object Angular. Right? Angular is a global variable, right, that was declared by the Angularjs library. When the Angularjs library loads, it declares a global object called Angular. Right? This is a very powerful object. It allows us to declare modules. Okay, modules is the mechanism by which Angular allows you to break up large applications into smaller little bits and pieces. Right? It's almost like the equivalent of an import or an include. Right? Now, in an import or include, those are reading dependencies into a file. Right? Whereas module allows you to do both things. It allows you to read existing modules that have been declared elsewhere, but it also allows you to declare brand new modules. Kind of like maybe in Java you would declare a package, right? You would declare a package, or you can import other packages. Yes. So module, the function allows you to do both things, right? And this is a very common pattern in JavaScript in general, right? They use the same function to behave in both ways, to be able to write, meaning create something, or read something that already exists. It's a very common pattern in JavaScript in general, not about Angular, in general. Right? So the dot module is a function that can take two arguments. Right? If it takes two arguments, right, it's intended to mean as creating a module, right? It always takes the first argument as the name of the module that we're referring to, right? In this case, to-do app, right? If it takes just one argument, right, the interpretation is that it wants to read a module or fetch a module of this name, which we don't have. Right? The module doesn't exist. So this would fail. Would say, I looked up module to do app, but I don't see it. Okay? The second argument, which is optional, right, is for declaring dependencies. Meaning, this module might depend on other modules. This is like the import part, right? So this is kind of like the declaring a package part, right, in Java or .NET, yes? And this part is the I am importing other modules that I depend on, yes? Okay? So the .module function, if it takes two arguments, it's interpreted as creating this module. Right? If it's one argument, it's interpreted as read an existing module. Make sense? Right? Here we don't have any dependencies because our module is going to be a very simple module. But because we want to create the module, I nevertheless have to provide the empty array. Right? This is how it understands that you are creating the module. Everybody okay? Right? All right, so there it is, our very first Angular application. If we load it, notice that it doesn't complain anymore, right? It doesn't complain anymore. It says, yes, I found that module that you were referring to, right? ng app is happy, right? This is our very first, simplest of Angular application. It's so simple that it doesn't do anything, right? Let's see if we could make it do something, all right? So a couple other things that the module allows us to do is to, for instance, add new behaviors to it. One of the things that we'd like to be able to do is to bind snippets of the HTML of the view and make it the responsibility of some controller. Right? What the controller does is that the controller's responsibility in an MVC design pattern, the controller responsibility is to receive events from the user. Right, as the user clicks and drags and and does things, it receives these events, and then it's responsible for interpreting those events and deciding who should handle these events, right? And it's like the traffic cop, right? It says, "Ooh, somebody wants to create a new post. Okay, who knows how to create? Okay, you." And so it sends it over to who is responsible for this. The controller doesn't actually know how to do it, right? Instead, it delegates this to presumably some kind of service layer or some business layer to handle this, some worker, right? And then that worker comes back with a response saying, I'm done. And then the controller receives the response and then gives the data back to the view for rendering, right? So you have this kind of circle, right, where you have the view generating events. So here you have the user generating events on the view. The view sends those events over to the controller. The controller sends it over to the module. And whether the module is accessible to the view is controversial. So I'll go with the model goes back to the controller and the controller sends it back to the view. Okay? So this is the basic MVC. The cycle goes view, controller, model, and then the model goes back and provides it to the view, the data, and the view renders that data. Okay, the view never actually manipulates the model. It only reads for rendering purposes. Make sense? And also, you'll hear me say this quite a bit. This is little m as opposed to the big M. But the big M is going to be on the server, right? Meaning the storage of the data, right? Relationships of the data. Full access to manipulation of the data. Here, the client is only ever going to have a small little snippet, right, of the entire data set. Yes? The view will only see only enough to be able to render on the page. Right? It will never actually have the entire data or query or be able to manipulate the data. Right? We're always going to have to go back to the server to actually manipulate the big M data, right, on the database and whatnot, right? And that we'll do in a couple of weeks from now, right? So let's stick to the little m for now, and we only have a couple more minutes. So let's create a little controller here, and to create a controller, we have an Angular a directive for that, which allows you to create a controller, right? And we'll call the to-do controller, right? And the controller is responsible, again, for its little world, right? You might have several snippets of views here, right? One for the header, one for the footer, one for the left-hand side, one for the right-hand side, the main content, yes? Right? Each one could have its own little controller, right? Which is responsible for its little piece of the page, yes? Here we have this controller. The to-do controller is responsible for this little snippet, right? Right? It doesn't have access or control over anything outside of this div. We say that the scope of this controller is this little div DOM snippet. Yes? It has its own little scope. Right? That's very important. Okay? So the to-do controller, right, if we refresh, notice that it's complaining, saying, you are referring to a controller called to-do controller, but I can't find it. It's nowhere to be declared. I don't see it declared anywhere. So let's go back to our app.js. Right? Let's do it right here. Typically, you would have a dedicated JavaScript file, but for now, let's keep it simple. Let's keep it right here. We're going to say Angular. We're going to grab that module we just declared. Okay, notice that right now, I am just grabbing the module. I'm reading the module. Right? It doesn't have that second argument. Right? So I'm only reading the module. And I am adding to it dot controller, right? Notice which is going to allow us to declare the to-do controller right here, controller, right? Notice the syntax here, saying Angular dot module dot controller, right? This is basically being able to chain several of these functions together, which if you spread them over long lines, it makes it really, really hard to read. It's common to break them up into separate lines. And this only works because of another JavaScript design pattern, which is very, very common, is that these functions return, right, return the original object on which it was called. Right? So this dot module function returns Angular so that we can call it again, right, on that original Angular. You see that? So these functions were written in such a way that allows us to chain these things together. It's not for free. Somebody wrote these functions so that you can chain them together. Yes? And it's a very common skill that you should learn, how to write functions that allow you to chain things together. It's a very common question in interviews, right? It says, write me a module that is reusable that you can chain together. It's a very common question. And we'll look at how to write those, okay? But there it is, right? It allows us to chain things together. So we could actually tie the whole thing together like this. Okay, I got the whole module, I declared it, and now I'm declaring a controller on top of that. Okay? Everybody okay? All right. All right, so here I have, I'm declaring the to-do controller, but the actual implementation is going to be on a function. A function is going to actually implement the controller. Right here I'm declaring it, but I am implementing it right here in a function of the same name. Everybody okay? Right? And in here I can say, alert hello from to-do controller. So if I refresh, notice that it says hello from to-do controller, right? We hit that snippet of HTML. It's tied to a JavaScript. It instantiates the controller, and it runs whatever's inside. Everybody good? So now we have HTML tied to the controller. So somehow we want these folks to talk to one another, right? And the way they talk to one another, the way they tie the bond between the controller here and the view, right, is through the scope. Remember, we said that each controller is going to have its own little world, right? Its own little scope, its own little area of responsibility, okay, which we refer to as the scope, okay? And what Angular allows us to do is provide a variable, a very special variable that its a specific name is $scope, right? That allows us to tie these two worlds together, the controller and the view, right? The scope allows us to create an object-oriented mechanism, right? That allows us the view and the controller to talk to one another. Anything that I declare on the scope, right, will be available on both sides. And either side can declare things on the scope. The view can declare things on the scope. It will be available on the controller. Or the controller can declare variables on the scope, and they will be available on the view. All right, so if this says hello, it says hello from to-do controller. Okay, the view can see this, and it can render it right away. And the way we do it, rendering, is by using, just like any other rendering engine or templating engine, right? We need some escape characters, right, to tell it that we want to render some data that is in some variable. Here, the escape characters is the double curly brackets, right? Meaning I am going to refer to an object here that somebody has made available for me. Right? Somebody magically has made available the variable hello. No magic here, right? The controller made it available, right? So there it is. I declared hello. Who put it there? The controller put it there, right? And if I render, there it is. Hello from the to-do controller, right? Who put it there? The controller put it there, and it's available on the view. Okay? Make sense? Now, this variable is what we call has double binding, right? Meaning that whatever the view does to that variable is available on the controller can see it, and whatever the controller does to that variable, the view can see it, right? It's doubly bound, right? So for instance, Angular provides mechanisms that allows us to broadcast whoever is interested in that variable, right, can see what happens to that variable, right? It can broadcast that things are occurring. Now, the reason we are using double curly brackets here is that we want to distinguish this from just hello, right? If I just write hello, right, this will be interpreted as just plain old ASCII text, right? It's just HTML, right? So if I render, notice it is interpreted as just plain old hello, right? So the curly bracket allows us to distinguish what the context is, right? This is a variable as opposed to a literal string, right? Make sense? Okay. Now this variable, the reason we needed to put the curly brackets was that there was no other way of providing the scope that we meant for this to be a variable as opposed to ASCII. Another way is to tie it to input and a model, right, which allows this variable is declared by the controller, right? The controller declared that variable, yes? Well, the view can also declare variables as well. Okay? The controller says hello, the view says goodbye. Okay? This is a variable that was declared on the view. The view declares it, the controller also sees it. Just like the controller can see, just like the view can see variables that the controller declares, it's vice versa. Actually, anybody who where that variable is referenced is notified of this one variable, right? So that whatever I type, right, on here, right, is bound to that variable, and anybody who has a reference to it gets notified and gets updated of the latest state of that variable. the controller anywhere across, and I can control the propagation of that binding between the controller and the view. Okay, and this certainly introduces a very, very powerful model of being able to work with views and data and controllers. Okay, and we'll continue that on Wednesday.